Welcome to Retro Fanfic Retrospective, the podcast where we dredge up old fanfiction and expose it to the cold, harsh light of 2019. My name is Amato, and with me are...
Dory.
And
Gaelan.
Oh.
Yeah.
Who are you?
I'm a voice emerging from the pre-apocalyptic rubble in Portland, Oregon.
Pre-apocalyptic. We'll see how many more weeks of government shutdown we can have before we reach full apocalypse.
Hopefully that won't be topical by the time this comes out.
At the time of recording, the American government is still partially shut down. Luckily for all of our listeners, we are considered a national security necessity.
We're essential personnel.
Right.
Vital asset.
So we're still going.
Mm-hmm. They have yet to pull our funding or freeze our assets.
To be fair, we don't have any funding, so it's about the same.
Yeah,
And yet we're deep underground in a bunker, protected from the outside world.
Gaelan, don't tell them.
Speaking of which, Gaelan. We've got Gaelan.
Hi, everybody.
This is yet another special guest. Gaelan is someone who I've wanted to have on, and I chose the topics of our fanfics for today exclusively to draw Gaelan onto the show. Now, I actually forgot to mention it at the end of last week's episode, so it's a total mystery, except that you saw the title when you downloaded this episode, so it's not. We are doing Final Fantasy Tactics.
Final Fantasy
fanfiction.
Tactics.
Advanced. No?
Oh, yeah, it's the Final Fantasy Tactics. It starts with the snowball fight, right?
Yeah.
Very memorable. It's a good game.
Oh, no.
As a
This was all a dream.
non-experienced tactics person, I've never played Advanced. Is Advanced very different from the original Tactics?
It's a different
In
game,
terms of gameplay, there's a lot of similarities.
Yes.
In terms of everything else, it's very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
I see.
But it does start with you and a bunch of other kids doing a snowball fight in the combat system, and it's like the most charming way to start a
Battle
square-based
tutorial.
battle tutorial.
That does sound pleasant.
It's charming, it's fun, and it has the cerebral combat mechanics of the original.
It does not have the cerebral plot of the original.
It's not what we're talking about today, though. I only brought it up because it's my only major frame of reference, but...
Pretty much the same, I'm sure. Close enough. Now, Gaelan, you are much more familiar with Final Fantasy Tactics, right?
That's right. So, just to introduce the game for our listeners, Final Fantasy Tactics was a high-budget game. It was of the generation of CGI-forward games right when that technology came to the fore with the PlayStation. It was right after Final Fantasy VII in terms of production, and it was a cinematic addition to the Final Fantasy series. It had a full orchestra soundtrack. It had an opening full CGI cinematic with reflective water and fog effects and cinematography. And so it was approached with the seriousness and ambition of a movie. So in the time, for me, who, I'd been playing Super Mario flat 2D video games, it felt like a immersive experience, almost like a VR experience in the late 90s.
Did you get on this when it was originally released, or...?
Just about. So I started playing it in 1998.
And how many years did it take you to stop playing it?
I'm still playing it to this day from time to time, I would say.
So you were like 9 or 10 years old when you were
That's
playing
right.
it.
I was a third grader.
Mm-hmm.
And Final Fantasy Tactics was different than previous Final Fantasy games in that it was grittier.
Also grittier, because it takes place on a grid.
Grittier and grittier.
I don't know if I love you or hate you, Amato. It's definitely one of those.
It was darker, and it focused on historical drama, betrayal, politics, and the target audience had lots of opportunities to stay with a dark, serious Final Fantasy game that was also full of magic and summons and things of that nature. So it was a tactical game, and the mechanics were tactical, but the theme of the game had to do with historical palace intrigue drama.
Sort of
Well,
like
and class struggle and demons and Catholicism, right?
That's right.
so it's kind of a historical
My favorite
fiction.
things. As an ex-Catholic communist, those are actually all my favorite things.
What are you saying, Dom?
So it's sort of like a historical fiction.
That's right. It frames itself in that way. In the beginning, the opening script is of a historian looking back at the history of a war and examining manuscripts from historians of the time that had been excommunicated. And so it frames itself as a historian looking at the fantasy of a historical event that had happened hundreds of years prior. So it plays with narrative a little bit in that way, but it doesn't really stick to that very much.
On top of which, the war in it is kind of supposed to be the War of the Roses, right?
That's right. So
Yeah.
it's a European mishmash storyline.
Just like every other fantasy-based franchise that comes out, it's based on War of the Roses.
Yeah, this is true.
Now, in finding fanfics for this, listening to Gaelan's description, you might understand why it didn't produce quite the same quantity of fanfiction as something like Final Fantasy VII, where it's like, oh, here's a cool aesthetic and people with big swords and they have personalities and they go
And also,
kill things.
I want Tifa and Cloud to kiss.
Yeah, that too. Want someone to kiss anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say those two, but
So I had a little trouble
maybe
finding...
me and Tifa.
I think that's the bulk of the fan fiction, although I think author insert in Tifa is probably a large section too.
You are basically
Yeah.
Cloud, Tori, so it's the same thing.
Oh my god, stop.
Looking at your blonde hair.
My giant sword that's just as tall as my body. And
Well, you're not that
almost
tall,
as
so-
wide.
We're allowed to talk about
Yeah,
the giant
exactly. Yeah, are we allowed to talk about how it's a metaphor?
An obvious metaphor. Now, oh yeah. So yeah, finding Final Fantasy Tactics fanfiction that I had some reason to think was good. It was a little tricky, but I found it on a site called Icy Brian's RPG site. I'd like to talk about it just for a moment because it's very old internet.
It's Icy Brian.
Icy Brian.
Covered in ice, not I.C. Brian.
No,
There.
ICY Brian.
Okay.
So this guy Brian Work, who now does like writing and drama and teaches in schools and stuff, he still has an internet presence of some kind. According to his website, he discovered Suikoden and Final Fantasy VII in 8th grade and made a video game website dedicated to them. And over the next 5 years, it grew into a hub of fanfiction for JRPGs.
Wow.
You know, from 8th grade. And like that's how the internet
incredible.
used to be. It's like there were gaping voids where nothing was, and if you were the person who was like, I'll put something into that void, then suddenly that was like an important site.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. I kind of missed my opportunity to capitalize on that. I made a website, but it was all like my fan art of different Digimon that I had created. So, you know.
Not quite the same demand.
I know. Exactly.
And so there were forums on this website as well. And hosted through the forums on this website, a fan named Maggie Rennie, who apparently had some money to burn, set up these contests called the All That Glitters Is Cold contests. Cold because Icy Brian, I guess, is the name of the website. There were 3 of them that took place between 2005 and 2006. A 4th was started and apparently had entries, but the website doesn't indicate that winners were ever declared. I say she has money to burn because there were cash prizes for placing in these competitions for JRPG fanfiction.
Yeah, but these provided by the host of the website? Like,
No, they were provided by this other fan, Maggie Rennie, who is the one to
Oh, I see.
thank for this effort. And yeah,
just a
People-
person said, hey, I want to pay people to write good
Yeah.
fan fiction.
and so I'd like a bit of an aside here.
Yeah.
If we had disposable income, which I know is a big if for all of us, if you're going to throw some money out there and be like, hey people, write some good fan fiction of this type, what kind of contest would you set up?
I mean, I think I'd probably do like a billionaire thing of going, surprise me.
I don't know if you would get that many entries though.
Yeah, it'd be kind of boring after a while. I think it'd be a lot of like shock value things that wouldn't actually be interesting. So it'd probably just fade away after a while.
I would probably go with a Harry Potter fanfic contest because there are so many authors and it would become more competitive and the good stuff would rise to the top and you might actually get some really good work.
I would definitely have like an under 18 competition, like encouraging kids to draw me what their Digimon partner would look like.
Aw, very
Absolutely.
nice.
And then I'd make sure that the cash prize was distributed based somewhat on the winner and then somewhat on the most deserving in terms of income level of their families. You know, as a communist.
So it'd just be like
I'd just be redistributing the wealth under the guise of a contest.
it would just be a social program of the guys of the contest.
Yeah, but then I'd get a bunch of kids fan art of Digimon, which is really all I want from my life, so...
Sounds fair.
It's a win-win.
How about you, Amato? What's your dark design?
Well, I've accumulated a bunch of fanfic ideas that I'm like, I should write that, except I never, ever will write that. I don't actually want to. I want someone to write it for me. So I would probably put up a list of prompts and be like, choose one of these, write a fanfic based on that. So, for example, my long-desired Carmen Sandiego Magic School Bus crossover, that would definitely be one of the prompts.
So
That's the main one that springs to mind.
Carmen Sandiego
and Miss
steals
Frizzle.
the Magic School Bus?
No, I would want Carmen Sandiego and Miss
Or
Frizzle to need to team up for something
team up.
educational of some kind.
Well,
To travel
in like
in-
the second part,
yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah, well, that would be fair. It'd be, obviously, you're right. It'd have to be conflict and then they team up.
Yeah.
How do you not know that Carmen Sandiego already doesn't team up with Ms. Frizzle and use
I
the
assume
Magic
she
School
must.
Bus to time travel already? That's what I think.
Are you saying Miss Frizzle is secretly a criminal?
Mm-hmm.
That's fair.
I don't think she got permission slips for all those field trips.
Yeah.
I like how we all had crazy ideas and Amato had actual patronage in mind.
Hey,
No, yours was
What
pretty
do you
grounded,
say,
though. It's pretty
Dom?
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too grounded.
Are you afraid to talk?
No, I'm not. I'm just excited to talk about a little bit more
Tactics.
about tactics, like the
All right.
plot and
Look,
Okay,
some
guys,
stuff
that's
like
fine.
that.
We'll get back on topic.
yeah. Getting back into the contests, both of these fanfics were second place winners in the first two contests. I should say each of these fanfics was a second place winner in the first two contests. Why did I choose those? Because they were the only Final Fantasy Tactics fanfics that placed in any of the competitions. And again, I was just looking for someone saying, hey, these were good fanfics, and someone thought these were good enough to give $35 to.
Were they JRPG themed competitions?
Yes, they were. All of the entries were JRPG of one type or another. And just to throw it out here, they judged it. There were a variety of judges, apparently representing a range of ages and tastes, and the fanfics were scored according to quality of writing and entertainment value, and the scores added up like that.
I knew that both of these fanfics had won silver medals and
And $35.
and $35. And it actually helped me to reflect on them and my experience of them as it went. And I thought, yeah, I can see how this would be an award-winning fanfic as I read it.
The first two of these fanfics that we're going to talk about is the second place winner of the first All That Glitters is Cold competition, Delita the King by Nistel. Now, unlike every other fanfic we've done, I actually got in touch with Nistel beforehand, and she was able to send some comments our way. And so I might be
That's
chiming in with some of her thoughts if there's anything that seems relevant.
Awesome.
The fact that that's never happened before is basically reflective that I'm really bad at doing my job. Not that all authors are impossible to find or they never want to respond to me. It's just I'm usually not on top of things.
To be fair, Amato, we never specified that was a part of your job per se.
Yeah, well, good. Then I'm not failing at it.
Yeah,
Exactly.
we're just disappointed in you when you don't come through.
According to Nistel, she spent a lot of time growing up at a babysitter's house with an older brother and other older boys around who didn't like her playing the video games, so she would usually watch them reading a book. But the Final Fantasy, apparently, first the original Final Fantasy game, and then the sequels were the first games that she got really into that was like reading a book, and she apparently enjoyed all of them all the way up through 7, right? This kind of prime height of Final Fantasy popularity.
Right.
And that includes things like Chrono Trigger and Xenogears and Final Fantasy Tactics.
Didn't you and Tarn kind of play this together?
We did, actually. We started out playing with our friend Ryan, who is a little bit older than I was. And actually, both my older brother and Ryan had a slightly more mature approach to it, and so it was exciting in that way. And because we started out playing with Ryan, I really had two different experiences. I had the first playthrough in which we were just crushed by the game, and it felt difficult and ruthless. And then the later experience of understanding the mechanics, playing through a second time, and then feeling like a god, just moving from battle to battle, significantly overpowered. So in both ways, there's a feeling of either of the power of the game. Either you have the power or the game has the power, depending on how you play it.
So just no fair contest either way.
Yeah.
It seemed that way.
Yeah.
I do feel like that's like kind of a good lead-in for us for something we kind of might have jumped ahead of, which is like we didn't really talk about Gaelan's relationship to us or Gaelan's relationship to, or any of our relationship to the media. Well, I just think it's interesting to point out that Gaelan is related to two of our prior guests.
It's all very incestuous, yes.
Yeah, well, but I just thought maybe Gaelan could say a little bit about himself. And maybe, like, he kind of already specified his relationship to Final Fantasy Tactics, but maybe we could also say something about our relationship as well.
More than happy to. So, again, my name is Gaelan. My older brother is Taran, who's been on this podcast, and my wife is CJ, who's been on this podcast. And so we're all friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way.
A few things about myself. I'm an art therapist. I had to stop myself from saying a D&D quip from an old character who always introduced himself as saying, I like guns and revenge. That's not true about me. I'm an art therapist, and I love reading psychology books. I love reading art therapy books because as an art therapist, I'm constantly dealing with the drama of people's lives, kids' lives, parents' lives, and it's a humbling job. I love the job. It's creative, and so I don't always have that much time to get into fiction anymore. I used to love getting into fantasy, and so this has been a lot of fun to revisit a game that I loved as a kid, the kinds of stories that I love, and fiction in general.
And you're itching to start talking about these stories, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's do it then.
Sure.
This first fanfic, Delita the King, by Nistel. And I'm saying Delita in English. I think that's right.
Delita.
Okay, great. So far, so good. Because Final Fantasy Tactics has a lot of names and place names.
That's right. So just a few more notes about what the overall plot of Tactics is, because the first fanfic comes as, it's almost a sequel to the game. So
Yeah,
I think it
it
might
definitely
be
is.
helpful to have a little bit of context about.
Does everything that happened in this particular fic happen after the game?
Yes.
Everything that happens in this fanfic happens after the game.
There's flashbacks to the game.
But the epilogue of the game kind of leads off this thing, I'd say. Yeah, Gaelan, introduce the outline here. Why not?
Okay, so the game opens with a pious princess who is captured, and over the course of the game, she falls in love with her captor because he was trying to save her life to begin with. But the captor, Delita, is essentially the antagonist of the story, but he's also the older brother or the brother figure of the protagonist, Ramza. Delita is taking revenge against the noble class by rising through the ranks of nobility to become a populist hero. So in the introduction to the game, the historian mentions that Delita is a beloved figure in history. He's a king who ended the Lion War and who ruled in a favorable to history way. He's looked on favorably by history. So Delita is the populist hero, and his inciting event was that his sister was murdered by a classist noble. So Delita was raised alongside Ramza in the Beal family, which is a noble family in Europe.
How are you saying that last name again? Because I've never heard it spoken.
I say Beowulf,
Beowulf?
but again, this goes a little bit to the language. Do you want to talk a little bit about the language as a brief aside before we go into more of the plot?
We're going to have to, I think.
All I can say is that in preparation for this fanfic, for these fanfics, I read an LP of the original Tactics translation, and it's rough going. It's rough going both because the translation is pretty spotty and because the source material is very detailed. So, for example, the end of Chapter 2. Here's what the game tells you happens at the end of Chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
In a text up from the historian. Goltana went to Lysalia and confined Ruvelia in Bethia for kidnapping the princess and let the princess accede to the throne. But Larg insisted Oranus was the legitimate successor and had him accede to the throne. Then Larg became the regent as a guardian. Immediately after, Larg sent the Hokuten led by Aureus to Bethla to rescue the queen. Meanwhile, Goltana sent the Nanten led by Olivia. This is the beginning of the upheaval which would later be called the Lion War.
I didn't understand a word you just said.
But yeah, there's like the two random Japanese group names in there. It's kind of
Okay,
hilarious.
Well, what's amazing about this? Okay, here's what's amazing about this to me. For one thing, as a player, you're like, yeah. Okay, I don't care.
Right, let me go kill
It's
somebody.
fantasy jargon, and in any good fantasy game, there are all kinds of self-important names and locations that are off-screen, and so you kind of have that feeling. In addition, the developers of this story were born in the 60s in Japan after World War II, and there's this investigation in a way into European history. And the sites in the game are derived from French, German, and English names, and they're all sort of thrown together. All the families have these different names. And they revised the language in an updated, recent re-polishing of the game that uses sort of Shakespearean language.
A bit too much in my opinion. I think I cited that at one point as being a overdone translation.
That may be true, but it actually hangs together from what I've seen of it, which is more than you can say for the original translation.
I guess that's true, but I'm not looking for Shakespearean language in my PSP portable game.
All I can say is that as you play through the game, it's a immersive game. It feels heavy, and it's an emotional game. So it's really not about the facts of where they are and who the people are, because one of the catchphrases of the game is the truth only what we can see? And the answer is no, because the people who are writing this game are trying to make the characters complex, to have backstories, their own cultures that they're coming from, motivations, and the player doesn't get to know a lot of this history. They're just sort of provided with some of this language. And so even though the original script is this mismatch of French and German and English translated from Japanese, it just comes across as a fantasy vocabulary that is pretty familiar to Final Fantasy players.
Now, this fanfic kind of leads off of various events. Can you talk about the epilogue really briefly? In the epilogue of the game, we have Delita already having acceded to kinghood by marrying the princess, like a hero does, I guess.
Right, and just very briefly, the game compares these two essentially brothers. They're not brothers by blood, but Ramza, the protagonist, is a naive noble who's trying to be ethical and do the right thing.
Because Ramsa's the player character in the game, right?
Yeah.
He's the player character, and he starts out as a young sort of academy recruit who ends up being sort of a weapon of the state. He's a part of the army oppressing a beleaguered and starving and desperate population that is, after this long 50 years war, they are attempting to overthrow the monarchies, which are destabilized. So it compares this young noble who's naive and who gets a bucket of cold water in the sense of meaningless and sometimes cruel deaths and murders through war, with his brother, who is a commoner who is, they don't explain why, but, or at least if they do, I don't know it well enough to know why, but he was raised with Ramza. He's a commoner who was raised as a brother to Ramza, and his sister is murdered, and so this is where they diverge, and it explores whether the means justify the ends, as Delita, the person who's more of a commoner, starts to make morally gray and sometimes overtly, I guess, violent actions and subterfuge in order to achieve his ends, as opposed to Ramza, who is essentially trying to fight with a band of his party,
Mathematicians.
monks, time mages,
People
Final
throwing
Fantasy,
items at people.
to essentially save the princess, right? And so Delita kidnaps the princess falls in love with him, and then at the end of the game, after the second, kind of the third act of the game, which is all about religious corruption, which is a major theme in the game, where essentially the clergy are the the dark cabal that are actually seeking to rule the kingdom, and the clergy are actually possessed by these demons. So the third act is all after Ramza and Delita go their separate ways based on their political beliefs. Ramza really finds out that there's all these demons controlling everything.
I think that's the one thing that's not relevant at all in these two fanfics.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, that's
so,
actually a
so
good
anyway,
point.
after all that, Ramza slays the demon and rides off into the sunset. And Delita, it flashes forward in the epilogue to Delita. He's now king. All of his rising through the ranks has allowed him to become king and rule the way he wants to. And he's married to Aurelia. And in the post-credits scene, he comes upon Aurelia. It's Aurelia's birthday. This is the princess that he had kidnapped, and now it's his wife. And he finds her outside of some ruins. He tells her everybody has been looking for her, and he's brought her flowers. And she turns to him and she says, "You use everybody like that," and stabs him. And so it's this Shakespearean twist at the end. And she says, "Now you'll kill me like you killed Ramza." And so she stabs him, and then he stabs her, and they both collapse.
But we know from the historian that he apparently, seems to have lived on and been a successful king.
Came out of it
Or-
unscathed as far as reputation goes.
Or and as far as reputation goes, and additionally, I believe in conversation with Nistel, she was referencing what's the follow-up in continuity, Vagrant Story, as showing that he apparently survived that. He seems to have lived longer than that.
Exactly. So one thing I love about Final Fantasy Tactics is that, like I said, it has a beautiful soundtrack. It's got a full orchestra, and it's cinematic. It explores some darker themes like a young noble and his best friend and brother figure who go separate ways when they're faced with moral dilemmas. And so they have a cinematic trailer in the title screen with these 3 quotes that I think kind of summarize the main themes of the game. The first one is the truth only what we can see? And that kind of hints at how all the different characters have complex motivations and that there are shades of gray in how a villain is developed in this game. Each protagonist could be a villain from the perspective of one of the villains, and each villain could be a hero, depending on how you see it. And the second quote is, "Blame yourself or God," and that has to do with how there's this quote in one of these combats between the elite nobles and the oppressed people where they say, "Who gives you the right to kill us," essentially, the nobles in this class warfare. And Algus, one of the nobles, says, "The gods." And one of the rebel people says, "Well, your gods must be demons." And that sort of hints at how the second half of the game is about fighting demons. And then there's also this loss of innocence, coming of age of the young noble who wants to do well fighting in a war, and he's gradually disillusioned and discovers all this corruption both in his own family and in the church. So it's pretty somber, it's pretty bleak, and at the same time it's really interesting to a lot of the people who play it.
And I'm sure that the people who were writing fanfic about it were drawn to the same kind of
Depth.
depth of storyline and characterization, because they must have had a lot of motivation to be able to grapple with the complexities of that continuity and translation. This first fanfic, Delita the King, also has a historical record as a frame story. It's presented initially as being, records are initially presented that this is how the king, Delita, died. Though then I think that's kind of mostly abandoned through the rest of the story. And it's not written by that same scholar, what is it, Al-Islam Durai or anything like that?
Well, the first story is kind of, in the first page or first 7 paragraphs, it tells you a brief historical anecdote about how this king died, saying he was injured, someone went to get help, and 4 hours later he was dead.
Okay, yeah.
And then the structure of the story is 1 hour after, 2 hours after, 3 hours after, 4 hours after, what's happening at the time, and flashbacks going through the king's mind also.
Right.
Yeah, which I thought was a really interesting structure. Kind of reminded me of the Sailor Moon one we did, where it was the the 4 minutes, 5 minutes at when
Yeah.
when
15 minutes? I don't remember.
15 minutes. Yeah, it was like this minute, this happened, this minute, this happened. But in this, each minute is kind of his reflections rather while he is passing away.
Yeah.
And it gives us a lot of context. I think the structure is really well done, to be honest.
The basic setup is that Delita is going hunting with a couple of retainers, and like they dismount, and he goes after a stag that they have been chasing. I don't quite understand how hunting works. I don't particularly understand how hunting works in a Final Fantasy Tactics universe in particular. I guess you don't blast it with fire spell or anything like that. You don't calculate it to death.
No, apparently not.
There's a nice nod to how space works, where they talk about how the stewards are cornering the thing the stag that's being hunted in a grid-like manner.
So it doesn't run off the board.
Yeah, that brought a smile to my face when I was reading it.
Yeah.
But Delita goes in deeper after it, and they wait for him a while, and he doesn't come back. And when they go to find him, he is on the ground. He has been stabbed, apparently with his own knife, because that's the only knife around. It's got his blood on it. Mm-hmm. The stag, what's the state of the stag?
2 arrows in it and dead.
2 arrows in it and dead. Covered in blood?
The stag?
Yeah.
I mean, probably.
Yeah,
It's got shot with
probably.
arrows.
I don't think they necessarily specify that, but that Delita has these significant knife wounds.
Just one knife stab.
Not
right?
necessarily a knife wound, but like a stab or a scar. Like could have been gored, maybe.
Right. Yeah, the deer is shot, but not smeared with this blood, apparently. And so one of the retainers, hustles back on a horse to the city to fetch a doctor and a white mage, and maybe I think too much about these things. But what does the doctor do exactly?
I don't know. In both of these fanfics, they reference the chemist a lot, who comes in, or the doctors, or the chemist who comes in and takes care of them, and it's like,
Yeah,
why
chemist
would
is a class.
Well, white mage
Yeah.
can heal physical wounds, but can they clear up bacterial infections?
Oh, good question.
This is a very good question.
Doctor must be a new class that they added in the post-credits.
Yes.
The other retainer stays with Delita as he is getting kind of progressively more blood deprived or delirious.
In shock, maybe? I don't
Right.
know.
And he doesn't really understand how he injured himself either. He's sort of trying to piece it together also.
And the story never really tells you.
It does not. According to the author, her comment is, I think the fact that the wound is set exactly over the scar he has from Ophelia is telling.
Yeah.
But she doesn't go far as to have a exact thing that happened.
I do want to say that there's a hint to it in hour 1, and I think I said minutes before, but it's broken up by hours. In hour 1, the first paragraph is Delita cannot remember how he injured himself, and the end is, yet afterwards, he describes what happens when he was chasing the deer. He says, yet afterwards his memory turns blank, white as it has done with increasing frequency over the past several weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of have this idea that he's getting increasing numbers of memory blanks, and that he, I don't know, might have some sort of dementia. He's quite old, and that this is something he could have easily done to himself and not remembered.
Yeah.
I think that's the impression we're supposed to receive.
Probably. But, this being a fantasy world, a vengeful ghost is probably just as good a possibility as anything else.
Yeah,
whatever.
Something's going on, though, with his brain.
Something's going on. And we get some various flashbacks over the course of the story. Like, the first main big flashback we get is sort of designed to show how he was beloved by the people, and at least initially as a king, was very actively thinking of himself as being a king for the people, and also very consciously presenting himself that way. Because he's always, as a character, a very kind of pragmatic, real politics sort of leader.
Right. Delita is a populist anti-hero. And so he's constantly motivated by the cruelty of the nobles, and in particular in the game, Algus, who's this sort of psychopathic noble who is in opposition to Ramza, who's the good noble. And yet he's betrayed by Algus.
Yeah, I will say it's funny. You pointed out, like, Gaelan, you having played the game, having more context, saying in the context of the game that Delita was more of a antagonist than a protagonist, because I think both of these stories kind of paint him
Kind of nice.
more,
in favor of
yeah,
it.
more favorable, or Ramza more antagonistic.
Well, I would
So-
say both the game and the fanfic play with the irony that Delita hates nobles, and yet he becomes a king. He becomes the noble of nobles, and he hates murder for the sake of power or indiscriminate murder, and yet he commits these murders as the king. He sends these nobles to be executed.
Almost without a thought.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that's the second main flashback after an interlude where he's talking with the squire who stayed with him, and it's not that interesting. He's just kind of delirious and being like, "Well, what happened?" And the squire's like, "Your Majesty, what happened?" And it's not the biggest deal. But the second main flashback is Delita's declaration of outlawing nobility, and he's going to seize all the property. He's saying anyone with noble blood, a noble title, has to come out and forsake their title and swear allegiance to the new regime, and then it's going to be fine. Otherwise, we'll throw you in the dungeon and probably kill you in a few years if you haven't come around.
And they have a grace
Yeah.
period of 3 months in order to accomplish this.
Right.
But this is his goal for like creating equality, for like bringing up the commoners from being treated like animals without souls, to having everybody be equal. And he's saying like, give up your property, like become equal with everyone, or there will be a punishment, because that's his incentive. And it actually, it seems like fairly reasonable to give them an incentive.
It's fairly reasonable in some ways. But like Gaelan said, there's that irony. The quote of the
There is
fanfic
that
is,
irony,
"Make no
yes.
mistake, the aristocracy will be eliminated," said Delita. "Class
yeah,
has no place
yes.
in a civilized society," says the king. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and his compromise is 3 months as a grace period for nobles. If they don't, then they get imprisoned for a year. If they don't, then they get killed. And every noble after that hasn't said anything, no matter like if they're informed or not, are just automatically killed.
Right, and part of the theme
so
of
there's some of that stuff.
And I think part of what's beautiful about Final Fantasy Tactics as a narrative is that it's a circular narrative, and the historian, even though history reflects Delita as this good king, he's ultimately propped up by this clergy that have in the game are shown to be corrupt.
Pretty thoroughly corrupt, yeah.
Right, and so the idea is that history in this sense was sculpted by the victors, sculpted by the clergy, and so whether or not he really was a good king or whether he was a fascistic king is up to interpretation.
Now, in hour 3, which is like the next time he comes to his senses and he's talking to his steward, at this point he's more out of it. And this is when he realizes, I was stabbed in the same place that Ovelia stabbed me at that one time. And he's trying to communicate this to the squire who doesn't get it. He's like, the same place and the same knife.
He's like, oh, yes, we are in the same place you were an hour ago.
Yes. He's like, no. He's trying to communicate. And this was the most interesting, I thought, the conversations between them was, because he starts babbling about that whole incident. He says, she wasn't strong enough to pierce the muscle. It was her birthday. Sire, you are not yourself. You don't know what you're saying. And then I killed her. There is a silence. The wind picks up, rustling through the tree branches. Dead, dry leaves sweep the ground. The steward slowly removes his hand from Delita's. Your Majesty, he whispers, the first queen died of the plague, a sudden contraction of the plague. Do you remember, Majesty? And this is one indication, and there's going to be another more major one in the fanfic, that everyone's complicit in sculpting this narrative of Delita. And in this case, the squire here is hearing some compromising information, kind of choosing not to believe it. And the very story that she died of the plague is because his chancellor finds him after that incident. This is, a flashback from a later scene. His chancellor finds him with blood and finds the dead queen, and he's like, what the hell happened? But
this would be a direct a continuation of the epilogue of the game?
It would. That would be immediately after, right?
That's right. So just this quick summary of the epilogue of the game. The King Delita is come upon his wife, the queen, and again, so he's the hero of the common folk. And after all of this game, you want some redemption of Delita, that all that he's done to achieve his power will come to some positive ending. And this is after the credits. And she stabs him, and it's sort of a gut punch to the player, seeing this anti-hero who could be redeemed being stabbed. by the princess, essentially, who's now the queen.
Did they give a reason?
The reason is that she believes that he killed Ramza, the protagonist of the story. That's what she says. And she's come to believe that he has become corrupt. She says that he's used people, essentially.
Which is
all
certainly
along.
true.
Right, and he has. That's his...
Stabbed a lot of people in the back to get where he is.
Right, and so, in a sense, her stabbing him is a way of saying that, essentially punishing his own corruption or the sins that he's committed along his journey to power.
But he doesn't take the stabbing line down.
Yeah.
That's right. So after she stabs him, she says, "Now you're going to kill me," and he does. He stabs her right back. It's
Yeah.
very Shakespearean.
And
Yeah.
in this fanfic, what happens after that? He's very dazed by it, but the chancellor finds him and takes him aside and kind of cleans the whole thing up and has a little speech to him. "Your Majesty," whispered his chancellor into his ear, "what has happened today is unfortunate, gravely unfortunate, and I won't ask you how it came to be. But in return, you mustn't allow these events to be the end of all you've struggled for. You must never speak of them. Can you imagine what it would do? How the people would view you?" And he puts forth this story. And then, in that same memory scene, the chancellor leaves the room, sends in the chemist to treat him, and the chemist is like, "King, if I may say so, it's an incredible honor. You're a huge inspiration. My family was suffering and starving back during the war, and you turned things around for the common people like me." And so you definitely get this like double blow of like the reality versus the legend and the isolation that he's never going to be able to talk about this.
And the chemist says stuff like, "I thank heaven every day that they gave you to us, and that's God's truth."
Right.
And like people died, but we were able to live because of you.
Yeah. It is a really funny, like, it's interesting, like I mentioned before, just to hear that different, like, the summary of actually how Tactics portrayed the characters, because in this fanfic, it's like, you kind of get the idea that this is almost like a portrait, like a difficult portrait of a hero, rather than, I guess, the more of a villain he was supposed to be in the game.
He's not
Or
the
not
villain
villain,
of the game, though.
or
Anti-hero is a better word.
Anti-hero, I suppose. But, I read it as a difficult portrait of a hero. Like, I really thought in the game he would have panned out to be, like, a heroic character, and they were just saying, like, oh no, like, here are the messed up things that he did. You know what I mean? And that's what makes it so fascinating to, like, kind of reflect on.
Here's what I would say. As a third grader playing the game, Delita is so mysterious. He pops up from time to time, and he seems to be working towards the greater good, and you really want him to be an anti-hero in the redeemed sense.
It just kind of came off as inscrutable.
Here's the author's comments about why she loved Delita so much. She says, "He gets the usual, here literal, fridged, loved female relative, but she's not his only motivation. It's his motivation to work with the establishment and to work alone, to talk through any side of his mouth while being 10 steps ahead. Ultimately, and according to his beloved status in Vagrant Story, he was successful in playing this game, eliminating earthly threats and knowing to send the strongest hero he had to go after the real evil. He will kill, shockingly, to get stuff done, but just as shockingly, he will zag when he will zig, allowing Balmafuda and Orlandu to live when he didn't have to, for instance. In this story, I wondered where Delita would be 50 years old. Would he be magnanimous? Maybe. In Vagrant Story, he's remembered in that way. Or could he still be acting? Or, in his last words, both?"
So was it to say the author said that this was supposed to be Delita at 50? Because I read him more at like 70 or something.
At his death, I think...
They're like arthritic knees and all of this stuff that reads as like an old man,
They do a lot of jumping up and down things,
Yeah, I suppose.
in combat.
I didn't read him as elderly. He was going out hunting the stag.
Yeah, that's not a
Maybe
70-year-old.
60s. Okay, you're probably
They
right.
at the beginning of this story, they date it as 1046.
50 doesn't seem that.
And they say they said they got crowned at 1008. So about 36 years later or something.
Yeah, okay, so 50s.
Okay,
I can do basic math.
50s. You think he got crowned when he was like in his
No, it
20s,
says-
or
Yeah, oh yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, something like
I'm
that.
just- I'm-
Well, it's
I'm only
Final
curious.
Fantasy. He probably got crowned when he was 14.
Yeah, this is a very good point. So he's not as old as I thought he was, but he still lived a life.
Yeah. And then the last scene of the fanfic is kind of lengthy and definitely, climactic. And at this point, it's unclear how accurate his memories are, because there's definitely weird things about this last scene. He's slipping kind of in and out of, well, I mean, it's all memories, but I should say he
is confused in the moment too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's indications that these memories might not be reliable, and things might not have happened this way. But a footman comes to him, and this footman, the author says she worked really hard on the names, and specifically chose the name of one of the possible generic NPC party members that Ramza can have in his party. This footman is Radcliffe. And
Which is a cool name.
It's a cool name. I'm sure she chose the coolest of the names.
Well, I think the steward's name is Collins, so not quite as cool.
Colin, yeah. Well, it was still thoughtful, I'm sure. Radcliffe comes and he's like, hey, we turned up a noble. And Delita's like, oh, really? That's crazy. It's been like 40 years. Or however long that's been in effect. I thought we killed everybody.
Yeah, okay, slice them and dice them, let's go.
We'll kill everybody, or they renounce their names. So he's like, yeah, well, the statute of limitations is way past. And Radcliffe says, Your Majesty, he's a bill of, what? What's the name? What's the last name of Ramza? Beowulf?
Beowulf.
I have no idea.
Beowulf.
But I would say Beowulf.
That's how my phone pronounced it. Not that you can trust my phone for much things, but it got Delita like the way we've been pronouncing it. I don't know.
And one thing, just as an aside, that I love about Radcliffe is as you play Final Fantasy Tactics, you do develop relationships with the randomized named characters that you find. I remember there was a character named Nox that became a knight through the job system. His personality, because he was a strong fighting type character, he became this upfront warrior. And I always thought of Nox as this strong, actual character in the story, even though he was essentially randomized. But through the job system, he became a knight, became a samurai.
No, I was just imagining that Radcliffe was in the party for about a chapter before Ramza kicked him out to get space for a monster that he was going to turn into a perfume.
That would make
sounds
sense. But I love that the author considered that.
Radcliffe tells him, we found a Beowulf, whatever. Specifically, it's Ramza. And I really love this scene in a theatrical sense because Delita goes through like 5 different emotions over the course of just like that part of the conversation alone. I really want to see this staged because like there's a whole lot of character beats happening that we're going to have to sort of skim over, I think.
You could do some good cinematography with this, I think.
Absolutely. Good blocking. And yeah, Radcliffe says, look, I know you said at this point any nobles we find are going to be killed, but I served with this guy when I was young, and he's genuinely a good person. Please spare him. And Delita kind of shouts at Radcliffe and orders him away and goes to face Ramza alone. Ramza's in like a little storage thing because they don't usually need prisoners there in the castle.
The footman's given him the whole spiel, spare this guy, and Delita's just getting more and more like confused and agitated at the same time. Until it just, be silent, he said in a hiss. Still your tongue, and remove your hand before I have it removed from your arm.
Yeah, this was the point in the story that Delita became like super unlikable for me. Like it was like everything else he did was there was like a certain reason, even when he does kill his wife, which is horrible, but she did attack him first, and he was perpetrating self-defense. And so you can understand that. At this point, he's just like, you're lucky that I'm banishing you and choosing not to hear what you said instead of just killing you outright. And I was like, whoa, dude, that's harsh. Like, he was just asking for, somebody he cared about to be spared.
Sure glad we abolished that class system.
Yeah, right? That's the messed up part about it, is when they're like, wait a second. Because he's a footman, so he's like, still your tongue, you not noble. So.
And the scene with Ramza is where things get the most fuzzy ambiguous. Because for one thing, he's dressed in the same armor that Delita saw him in last, which is bright, shining white, quote, blanched by the light of God. And for another thing, he barely talks. He just kind of stares at Delita, and Delita talks at him, except for a single line. Delita sort of goes into a whole spiel where he's like, oh, Ramza never thought I'd see you again. He seems to harbor anger at Ramza for, like, in his view, everything having been so morally easy for him. It's like, oh, you just had to go and, do the right thing all the time, and I had to do the hard stuff.
Yeah, this would be a fun scene for the Delita actor. To
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If we have some money, that's what we should do. Tell people to do a student art film version of this fanfic.
Fan fiction, fan films.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit to praise in the writing here, actually.
I thought the writing was very strong in this whole last
to kind of jump
bit.
off that, like, yeah, like in terms of Delita as a character here, is like Delita let out a bark of a laugh when he saw who was there, and it's Ramza, like this, his long lost brother, and it just, this whole scene is him like really going in on himself, but like talking to Ramza. I thought the writing there was super good. I would like to see that acted out.
Yeah.
Gaelan, what do you think about the Ramza in this scene? Did that seem Ramza-ish?
Well, I would say that I agree that there's some ambiguity in whether this is an actual flashback or whether this is his own experience of his death. And but I'll talk about that more in a sec.
I do agree with that too. But yeah, go on.
After he first says, well, sorry you turned up, Ramsay, I guess I'm going to have to kill you because statute of limitations on being a noble is over, sorry. And then he has his little rant, and then finally he's just like, say something, damn you. Don't you dare just sit there. Say something to me. And what Ramza says is, and what did you get, Delita? And that's significant because it's a line of Delita's.
That's right. So in the epilogue scene, when Delita has just been stabbed, he says something along the lines of, Ramza, what did you get? As in, out of all of these experiences that we've had and all the choices that you've made, what has come? What's your experience of that? How do you reflect on that now at the end?
What has come of it,
Yeah, and then there's this response in the scene that we're witnessing, which is unclear if it is actually a reflection, like Gaelan pointed out, and we'll get to that, or if it's an imagining. But what did you get, Delita? There was silence. Delita's mouth didn't seem to work. He tried to laugh. I didn't want anything. I never wanted anything. But he knew Ramza with his steady blue eyes could see through his lie. That's intense. Like, I feel like that is the absolute climax of this story.
Right. So I think the author leaves it open to interpretation how this wound that kills Delita came about.
Yeah.
And I think it's a stylized fan fiction, and that it uses a lot of imaginative kinds of writing that leave it open to the reader to understand. I got the sense, because the wound is directly over Ovelia's stab wound, that he stabbed himself. And that and again, this is my own guess based on reading the story, and that he is flashing back or responding to Ramza, who's his old brother, essentially.
Moral compass, maybe?
Right, and who in the story in Final Fantasy Tactics, that's the last person that he dialogues with, and it's also in this fic, it's the last person that he dialogues with again, as in both cases, he's been stabbed. And Ramza is essentially the brother that comes to mind. In the game, Ovelia stabs him because of his hypocrisy. And my sense is that if I'm right about it being a suicide, which I, maybe I'm not, that it's his own reflection on his own hypocrisy.
And it seems like there's some self-hatred in there, yeah. And in this last scene, the author's comment was that whether or not it's actually happening or happened as such is less important than the decision he comes to. And at the end, someone comes and, asks him, so sorry, what are we going to do with this guy?
So, yeah, I kind of like this scene because, like, he's having this moment with Ramza. He's, like, engaged and distressed. Then he turns and looks at the window and acts as if Ramza isn't in the room anymore, which could be, like, two different memories bleeding together.
In fact, yeah, there's even the person asks him, like, sire, and then he's thinking, Ramza. Delita had just been speaking to Ramza on Nora's birthday, but nothing had happened on Nora's birthday. Other things. Ramza had died 10 years ago in Mudrond. No, 40 years ago? Delita had never seen him again, hadn't he? And so that's where it's really getting completely just, what's the term I'm looking for? Unambiguously ambiguous?
Unanchored to reality.
Muddled, I suppose.
The unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Right.
I think at this point, if I was, like, directing it, I'd put, like, some of, like, forest loam on the bottom or something, or maybe, like, a stream or a dead deer in the room.
The lighting would definitely be changing.
Well, and we're only about 4, 5, 6 paragraphs from the end. Some of the paragraphs are very short because they're
Oh, yeah.
dialogue. So
We're finishing it up.
what I mean is, we're looking at a man who's fading from life.
Right.
So these are all his recollections, and it's just getting muddled. And this is where we get that connection between what is the memory and what's actually happening for him. Like, the memories are blurring together.
The last couple of paragraphs are a decision to make, and this is from Delita's perspective. Suddenly, Delita's mind cleared. He could feel Ramza's gaze on his back. All that Ramza knew and all that Ramza could see, he felt. No, Delita said to the window. No, execute him, right now. Keep it quiet. He heard behind him faintly, Yes, Your Majesty. A shuffle in the room, a clanking of chains. They did not interest him, however. Through the window now, through the blinding whiteness, he could see something else. A man standing at a window, old, young, crowned. His back was straight, his shoulders broad. His arms were crossed. He looked noble, heavy with his thoughts, heavy with his honor. He looked as a king should, unless, Delita thought, you knew what was behind him. For Delita, his eyes, white, did.
The end.
Yeah. Which it says a lot right there, just that last chunk.
It does.
How he sees himself as like both old and young at the same time, and noble. I mean, used here as a good term, but used by Delita as a pejorative most of the time.
Yeah, like he wanted to delete the nobility and not and at first, he said, not in a way that punishes them, necessarily, but it punishes them for not revoking their nobility, but also just like creates the idea of equality. But then it does, like you said, become a pejorative because of the nobles who resist him. Like, I don't think, in at least this story, he ever anticipated that resistance. He thought people would come around and we'd all be equal. And then he ends up being this Punisher king. And it's so very bizarre. It's like he's recognizing himself that he became the noble.
And he says he looks how a king should.
Yes.
Unless he
And
knew
very much
what was behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He became the noble that he hated.
I like that paragraph.
It's very good.
Yeah.
It's very well written.
Part of what I thought was interesting in this story is how in the game, as Ramza, you're encountering all of these moral dilemmas, and you're often killing people as you go. I mean, Ramza, he's white in this story in Delita's mind because compared to Delita, Delita is like, all right, I'm leaning in. I'm going to use subterfuge. I'm going to use assassination, or I'll be compassionate from time to time because ultimately I have good intentions. Whereas Ramza isn't willing to do that. He actually becomes a mercenary, but to protect people, right? He becomes sort of a hired hand. So I think Ramza is portrayed in this fic as being this more ethical friend to Delita, when really Ramza's confused throughout the game. He's very confused, and what I loved about this is Delita becomes confused as well, right? And so he's questioning himself in a way that Ramza did throughout the game. And so he kind of becomes the protagonist.
And as one final comment, in conversation with the author, unlike usual, I thought it was kind of cool. She mentioned that she specifically did not make any mention of his sister, that she wanted her to be conspicuous by absence in this fanfic, at least on an unconscious level. So, like, it informs everything that happens, but she's not, like... I guess it's long enough ago that Delita probably wants to think that he's over it, probably, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And that's a very smart narrative choice.
Moving on, the second fanfic we read is called The Ending of a Revolution by Alexander Olivia. This was the second place winner in the All That Glitters is Cold 2 fanfic competition. And apparently Alex Olivia was a fanfiction writing friend of our first author, Nistel, and she convinced him to enter the competition. And he was $35 richer for it.
Cool.
And also got a piece of artwork by someone named Cute Luca. But we do not have that artwork.
When this came out, it was probably a lot of money.
Oh, yeah, 50 years ago. Now, when did this come out again?
Sometime in the 60s.
I think you could buy a comic book for 50 cents. Back in
You
2005.
could buy a PlayStation for a nickel.
I remember those days, the good old days.
Of course, we drew our PlayStations on the sidewalk with chalk. Anyway, this fanfic, The Ending of a Revolution. Can I say more straightforward than the first fanfic?
You can say that, yes.
Yeah.
It is
I'll allow
basically the events of the first book, or first part, whatever you call it, of Final Fantasy Tactics.
The prequel?
But, no, not the prequel, just like the first part of the game.
I was like chapter 0, then chapter 1 after this.
It's chapter 1 then.
Right, it's an illustration
Oh,
of a
okay.
sequence, an illustration of a couple of scenes in chapter 1.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
from the perspective of a different character.
Okay, Dom and I were a little confused about that because of the youth of Delita and Ramza. We weren't sure.
Now, I vaguely remember going through this part. This is about as far as I'd gotten in the game before
Yeah.
being frustrated at having to guess where people are in order to cast spells.
Yeah, and I
Can
was a
you
little
peg the
confused
spell to them or
'cause-
something?
No, you have to target a square, and then you have to still be there by the time it fires.
Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this character has sort of a brief role, and her death causes a chain reaction that is part of, for example, Delita and Ramza's split.
Yeah.
Which
The character's named Maluda, and she's kind of a leader that you fight a couple of times of a group called the Death Corps. And
Ah.
the Death Corps are, what do you call it?
It's part of the rebellion, essentially.
Right.
A band of people trying to change the ruling structure of.
Right, but if you're
Elves?
lower class militants going for a revolution, do you call yourself the Death Corps?
The Vanguard is what I would say. Wait.
What was the
Or-
Japanese name?
Yeah, no, their branding, I'm not so sure. about.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a like Hans, are we the baddies sort of thing. It's like, look, you're going for
I
the
know.
people's support. It's not going to be like, oh yeah, we're the Death Corps, join up.
Honestly insane, yeah. Like, and this is why the kind of like class stuff and tactics makes me a little uncomfortable. Is it's like the peasants should revolt and they should punish the nobility for like the things they've done to them.
Well, you're supposed to feel
Like-
really bad about the fighting that you're doing in this part of the game.
Yeah.
Like your
Yeah.
character Ramza is the one who's, well, both Ramza and Delita are to different extents being like,
Sure.
Should we be fighting these guys?
I think
Why
maybe,
are we
you
doing
know, at the
this?
time I was playing it, I couldn't grasp that. It felt very bizarre. I was young, you know. It just feels bizarre, right?
Right, and in this part of the game, you've got your wagon hitched to this sort of psychopathic, noble, snotty guy who is essentially saying these guys are animals. And so Maluda is this sort of side character. She's a hardened soldier. She's a member of the rebellion.
And
against-
she's the sister of the leader of the rebellion.
sister of the leader. She's fighting on the losing side. Her friends and her fellow rebels are being swept up by the militias, including Ramza. So I think she's kind of in retreat in this fanfic.
Well, yeah, it's definitely not a good time for the Death Corps. Like, they're being hunted down by the main characters in your, party when you're playing Final Fantasy Tactics. And so we get kind of the first fight that you encounter her in, retold. And all of the fights in this are much more grounded than they would be in Tactics. So there's no mention of black magic or, weird... Or, there's mention of white magic. They, like, after the fight, white mages are the ones healing and such.
Yeah, like 2 Final Fantasy Tactic fan fictions, we get 1 spell. That's about it.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, I think that was the main reason I thought they may have been written by the same author. Is they both kind of held this more like very real historical fiction. I think we mentioned before, like militaristic aspect rather than being the kind of fun fantasy that Final Fantasy has.
We'll just call it Final Tactics.
Sure.
There are a few great allusions to what kinds of abilities Ramza is using, but we'll get to that a little bit later.
Okay, so we kind of see this fight, and it's pretty brutal. It's like, here's random lines. Her mind was hazy, muddled from blood loss and the gauntlet she had taken to the side of her head, but she thought the corpse that she has just stumbled over was one of hers, one of the freshly recruited kids whose name she couldn't recall at the moment. His eyes still stared blankly upwards, his back arched painfully, his jaw muscles were locked open. Rainwater filled his mouth. He had probably died screaming. That's the kind of combats we're getting in this fanfic.
Hitting the ground running.
Yeah.
Yep.
And she's cornered by Ramza and Delita and Algus.
They change his name.
Whatever. The asshole. And an interesting thing here is we get this whole conversation that happens in the game between all of these characters. Like, they're she's been disarmed, and Rams is reluctant to kill her, and August is like, well, totally kill her. We don't even need anything from her, just murder her. And the dialogue is rewritten from the game to be much better than the translation in the original release of Tactics. And I was kind of curious whether the author was retranslating from the Japanese, or just translating from the bad translation into something that is better writing. But either way, we get this whole conversation. In the game, Melita's just at your mercy. In this, she is constantly calculating whether she can get away with stabbing somebody and getting away.
While being injured.
Right, while being injured. She's like spending the whole time looking for an opening to take one of these nobles out with her.
Right. In the
Just
game, she's
respectable.
courageous and angry and resolved. And in this, you see a little bit more of her three-dimensional personality.
Yeah, I mean, she actually seems a lot more hardened. Like, with the kid who died, she was basically, like, seeing the rainwater fill his mouth and being like, well, he was too young to fight anyway.
Yeah. It's a theme in this fanfic where, like, a through line of her characterization that it's one thing to, like, ask these young peasants to, like, join their rebellion when they think they had a shot, but now that they're kind of getting run down and crushed, like, she's feeling terrible about getting any of these people involved, especially the young ones.
Yeah, how moral is it to recruit when you know you're all going to probably die soon?
It's a little bit Les Miserables.
Yeah, I mean, she's feeling bad about it, but she's also making self-justification.
They thought they were
so-
going to win.
Well, yeah. Right. I mean, when they recruited these kids, they thought they could win too.
Yeah, but they're talking about recruiting afterwards, or
Oh, yeah.
as it goes on.
I suppose. Oh, yeah, you're right. Even, like, during the barricades. We're talking about Les Miserables now, right?
Sure.
I don't know. Shouldn't have crossed those lines. And this is the conversation that I think you hinted at before when we were talking about Algus, where he's saying, like, look, it's the will of gods that your peasants to be ground under our feet.
He's saying that they're animals.
Right.
Now-
Literally just animals.
Yes.
And she says, don't blame this on God. All are equal in God's eyes. And his position is, no, animals don't have God. God cares
Yeah.
about the nobles.
And I like this part because she was, like, incensed at that. She, like, I don't remember exactly what she said. She's sort of like, excuse me, like, how dare you imply that this is God's work? I don't think she necessarily says that, but she kind of thinks that she scoffs in her head, you know? I liked that personality in there.
And straight from the game, she stands out in a game with a whole bunch of characters who have names, and
Yes.
you can't keep track of all of them. I remembered her, like, when I started reading this fanfic. And especially since that's a big turning point in kind of the story.
Yes.
Ramza spares her life.
Well, I also like the characterization of her in this moment. Because, like you said in the game, she just comes off as, like, confident and proud and not really any... You can't really sense any difficulty.
No doubt, no.
Yeah. Like, in this paragraph, for example, Melita cleared her throat deliberately. What are you waiting for? Her voice was quiet and cracked, weaker sounding than she had expected. She tried again. Louder and steadier this time. Just do it. Better.
Yeah, and I also just found my part is, like, she literally does say out loud, don't you dare blame your sins on God, which is bold. Very bold.
On point. But she is spared because they've accomplished their military objective here, and Ramza, who is calling the shots, does not want to just execute a, like, person who's no longer any threat. I don't quite get why they don't capture her. I don't understand.
It's kind of actually hard to capture somebody.
Okay.
Well, you have to restrain them. You have to have somebody watch them. You have to give them food and rations. You
Takes
have
a
to
lot of
get them moving.
resources.
yeah, okay, but she's also like a leader. She's not even...
Right. Well, they're not high enough level to have a mediator yet.
Fair.
Of course.
Also, like, with this group of... Isn't this all a group of cadets?
Yeah, basically.
So maybe they just don't really know the importance of, like, her position or capturing her, and they're just kind of being, like, ignorant.
They could just be bad at their jobs.
They could just be young and not know exactly what they're doing.
And these
Right, and I think part of what I like is that she has this brief, retreating introduction to these characters, but it's not an in-depth dialogue at first.
What happens next?
Well, did we address the part where
She goes back.
Ramza, like, says that she's not actually an animal? I don't know if that's important, but it's not
I mean,
true.
it
She's
is.
not an animal.
Like,
she's just like us. She's not an animal. And August is like, this is betrayal. And Delita is like, I expected better of you, Ramza. Do it now, meaning kill her. We've wasted enough time already. And then somehow the captain decides that... Oh, wait, Rams is the captain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I think part of this too is it's a look at the perspective of somebody who is at the mercy of these three characters, Ramza, Delita, and Algus, who are all really arguing about whether to murder these people they're fighting while they're fighting them. And so she's sort of saying, oh my gosh, they're talking. I'm not sure what they're talking about. But they're really arguing about whether to kill them. And she's just thinking about, how do I survive this situation?
Yeah.
And the whole thing ends with like Ramza like trying to make things more human, and just as they leaving looks at her and saying, do you really hate us that much? And like she's like surprised, and just after a while just nods yes.
Yeah.
We're
She's
going to
shocked that he's naive, is what she
Yeah.
says.
And
the
we'll get-
naivety of the question.
Yeah, and we'll get back to that in the second conversation that is drawn from the later on in this fanfic.
Yeah.
But for now, she gets to retreat back to whatever rebel base they have. She's talking to another of the leaders, Golagros. I don't know these names.
Clearly it's Galagros.
Galagros, of
Really?
course.
I thought it was Golagros.
Clearly it's Golagros.
Cool.
And long story short, he's just gotten back from kidnapping a noble. This is the aforementioned sister of Delita. And they think she's a noble because she's dressed like a noble and she lives in a castle, and she's like saying, no, I'm not a noble. And they're like, yeah, we don't believe you.
And they're running out of options at this point. They're
Yeah.
like, well,
Yeah.
you really better be a noble, because otherwise it's
Yeah.
not good news for us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Melita's whole battalion got killed. The other one's retreating from a retreat. They're definitely on the out.
Yeah, and Golagros, when Golagros comes back with a captive, she's like, hey, you know what my brother said about taking captives. We need to have the moral high ground to win over the people. And his argument is, look, we are getting crushed. We have no choice. We need to do something to mitigate this, the disastrous military actions we've been having.
Also, if I didn't take a captive, then me and my men would have been dead.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they've got a captive now. And eventually she kind of comes around to that point of view because she's also, very anxious about the situation that they're in.
Now, this is kind of a part that I missed. Did they explain how they found her and took her captive? Like,
Well,
That's in the game. They just kind of take
Okay,
her.
they
She's
just
just
kinda
kind of
take
hanging
off
out,
from
and they
there.
just take her.
riding a
Got it.
chocobo.
Yep.
They're not high enough level to be teleporting everywhere yet.
Oh, yeah, that's unfortunate. They could have done a lot more if they were.
You'd think.
But it fleshes out what for the players. Just they took the sister of Delita, so clearly we're going to go kill them all.
Yeah.
Yeah, this background about why he felt like that was a good game plan at this juncture is kind of invented by the fanfic? Is that, or is it just implied? I don't even know.
Well, it's a part of the story. I mean,
Okay.
They say it, but this fleshes it out.
Yeah. Which is most of this fanfic, is things that were basically said but are being fleshed out.
So I think the fanfic really picks up in the final battle scene, which is really where all the action turns.
Yeah.
Maluda and Galagros and some of the rebels are going to meet up with her brother, and their goal is kind of to talk to him about how they might, like, where to go from here. Like, they've got a captive. What can we do with this?
Well, also, Melita and Galagros are arguing whether or not to tell their brother and the leader of the resistance to try to hang it up and retire and try to get as many people out alive as possible.
Yeah. Man, writing Final Fantasy Tactics fanfiction. I guess I was saying this before, with a lot of Final Fantasies, you can fall back on characters' mannerisms, and the main difference in Tactics are like philosophical differences of opinion or perspectives on like military war or class struggle. Like,
and often they look identical except for their outfit and essentially their outfit and their name.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of characters in Tactics, and a lot of it, it's like a game around that was partially based around just the innovativeness of the mechanics of the game, and partially around just like this political struggle. So having character-based fanfiction or character-driven fanfiction on it is really interesting. It takes a different tact, I guess.
It's kind of a shame, really, because most of the games that are like of the tactics genre nowadays aren't as deep in the story or character-wise. They're kind of just shovelware almost.
I don't know about these. Yeah, these days you're probably right. But I'm thinking back to other games of this sort of genre, and I think the Ogre Battle games kind of tried to go in this direction.
Yeah.
Right. So Final Fantasy
guess that's the
Tactics
same
is
author,
actually
isn't it?
literally a mechanical successor to the Tactics Ogre game because it has the same director.
That's right. Yeah, I guess that explains it. Gaelan, you were about to talk about the final battle in this fanfic. Can you lead us into that?
Right. So in the final battle, the characters in this story who are pretty complex and they disagree, but nonetheless they have this captive who is the emerging militia, the militia that's following them, one of the leaders' sister, who is not actually a noble.
Well, that's Delita. We just talked about him.
Delita's, yeah, so it's young Delita. All right, we got.
Yeah, they have Delita's sister.
Right, they have Delita's sister. And it's a pivotal moment in the game where she is killed tragically in this final battle.
Is this the fight when she dies?
Oh, no. So
No,
this is
not.
This is not, but they're retreating with her, and
Right.
she dies in that process.
She being Maluda.
Maluda does.
Yes, she does. But before that, she gets to talk with the main characters again.
Right.
And it's important in the game because of the turning point of Ramza. Like when she faces down Ramza during this fight when they're, getting crushed. And he's asking her again, like, so wait, I don't really understand why you hate us so much. And she has some good dialogue about it.
Right. And I would even say this is a cool fanfic in the sense that it's the end of the young Ramza. So after this and after the ensuing battle, he's going to join the mercenary corps.
Well,
Yeah.
even before these two fight, they square off, and like the Ramza and such tries to parlay,
Oh, right.
Right.
tries to say, hey, give up, and like the Maluda is saying, don't you understand that we can't? But Ramza's like, no, you totally could. I can talk to the prince. I can talk to the prince, and the prince, and everything will be fixed, and nobody has to die. And like, Maluda's like, are you serious?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
there's-
honestly expect me to believe that Dysendarg would mediate with the Death Corps? The only thing your darling brother would have for us is the gallows.
There,
And she's totally right.
Yeah.
there's an incredible paragraph like around that time too that basically says the same thing, but like Rom's asking, why revolution, why all this, are we really the ones who make you suffer? And then it's amazing because like after that, they're describing like with the dozens of men and women murdering each other around, all the blood, blah blah blah, Maluda came to a terrible realization. He was being serious. He was being utterly serious. She could have laughed or cried, but she did neither. She didn't move at all. And it's like, yeah, she just doesn't understand how he could literally be serious, and it's incredible.
And this is all rewritten game
It's
dialogue
well-
again.
Yeah, and again,
But-
but with her perspective, which
And
is
also,
so well done.
and also, it's rewritten to be more powerful than it was even in the game.
I just think that perspective of like, she came to a terrible realization. He was serious.
And-
It's just such a good line. Like,
Yeah.
it
Right.
gets everything in
And
perspective.
I think part of what makes that interesting is before we get there, we have this elaborate fight scene. So my absolute favorite, the Hakuten catch up with her. So she's fleeing from them, but they catch up and they have this dialogue and then they fight. Because she says, you know what, you're never going to actually let us go. We're in this rebellion. So many of my friends have died. You don't understand. So they fight. And in this fight, it's my favorite writing is, and in the middle or towards the end of the fight, leading up to this dialogue you're talking about, she found herself suddenly near the back of the Hakuten, her sword and arms stained with blood of however many she had killed to get there, 2 or 4 or 5, she never counted, and 2 ranks away was Ramza Beowulf, dirty and blood-spattered, shouting orders and waving his sword above his head passionately. She sprinted as best as she could in her heavy armor, smashing her way through the soldiers, separating them. And so this is my favorite because despite the gravity of the narrative of Final Fantasy Tactics, combat in Tactics is cerebral, it's slow, it's somewhat cartoonish, with both sides are just kind of marching in place,
is
patiently
true, yeah.
waiting their turn to fight. And so even though there's all this action that's happening, it's slow. And in this, it kind of shows what it would actually look like in real time.
Also, my understanding from reading that LP is that Ramza spends a lot of time shouting at people.
Yeah, they all stop fighting, and he's just like, hey, should we really be killing each other here? I'm not so sure.
I mean, he has some kind of shout ability that raises brave
Oh, yeah, that's true.
that he uses a lot.
And you get a lot of experience. You can use that to farm.
And it's a good point too, like cutting out that marching in place and also just that general like picking your moves and optimizing everything before you do anything element makes this a really dramatic story. But Gaelan, you're absolutely right. Like all of that other stuff takes away from the storyline in a certain way. It's
Yeah.
like you don't feel the drama. But these fanfics, both of the ones we've read, have made you feel really the drama of the story and
I
the
think-
punch.
If the drama didn't continue throughout the game, it would feel like such a mismatch because the combat is slow and technical and the story is kind of dark and dramatic. But because they keep the story moving through, it matches better.
And so once they clash a little bit, then they have that big turning point conversation, and it's the big turning point conversation for Ramza in the game because she says, like, I'm sorry that you're so ignorant and sheltered that you don't understand what's going on, and maybe you're right that like you want what's best for us, but as a noble, like you in your position is the enemy, and
Right.
we have to do what we have to do.
And I think actually there's not a huge amount of dialogue that Maluda has in the game, and one of the things she says that I love is that ignorance itself. I think she says something like ignorance itself is a sin, in that she wants to fight him because he's naive when she's suffered so much.
Right.
And this really highlights that.
And that's,
The author does a good job of drawing on those quotes, actually.
yeah, and expanding on them.
Yeah.
And that's what will lead Ramza in the game to kind of understand his privilege. And once Delita's sister dies, he finds himself complicit in all the events that led to it, even with the best of intentions and in the systems that led to it. But this fanfic is not Ramza's story. The ending of Maluda's story comes right here, because she gets killed by Ramza.
Right.
Yeah, to a few final words, just like Ramza saying, I never wanted to kill anyone. She licked her lips. Neither did I. But here we are. Then they just fight and Ramza wins.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a line that I really love, and I'm just going to look at it for a second.
Just enjoy it.
Yes, there's a line that I really love where right at the end, the last two sentences, she fell a helpless eternity to the ground. So she's dying, curled up into a ball involuntarily. She wished her armor was off. She wished her brother was there. She wished her parents were still alive. She wished she was still at the farm she was born at. She felt someone's hand gripping her own, and she held on tight. I'm so sorry, brother, she whispered, too softly for anyone to hear, and let her eyes close. And
Yes,
so there's that question of what's she feeling when she's feeling someone gripping her hand or comforting her. And I guess I think of it as Ramza and his innocence.
Yeah.
And the fact that he doesn't want to be in this fight. He's the unwitting soldier. And he's killed her, and so he's kind of holding her hand.
And she's not even a dehumanized enemy to him. Like, he's talked to her before. He's had 2 conversations with her. He's not thinking of her as like a faceless villain either.
Yeah.
But you could also read it as, what, in her mind, like her brother? Or
Well, yeah,
reaching out
because
to her
she
brother?
also says, I'm so sorry, brother, after
Right.
she feels the hand gripping her own. But, yeah, I mean, aside from that, too, like, I've actually read this last part 3 times now, just to get the, like, a beat of it, and this was the first time hearing it, I'm still kind of getting teary-eyed. Like, it was very intense.
There's some good
It's
lines in
very
there,
well
like
written. Yeah.
when he's slashing her, that the slash that's going to kill her. He moved too fast, moving aside her strike, sword raising, and she could feel 1,000 miles of vulnerable space between one shoulder and the other. That's a really cool line.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then this ending is extremely emotional, like wishing her brother was, she wished her armor was off. Like, I felt like that was the most beautiful part of it, is she doesn't want to be fighting.
Yeah,
like,
throughout the whole
you can
thing-
see it as physical, but you can also see it as like she just doesn't want to be this soldier.
Yeah, throughout this whole fanfic, they really made you care about this character.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they really did.
And they
did a
don't
great
go
job.
too deep into her underlying motivations of what does she want for her family. What, and they don't need to.
No,
and
they
they
don't.
summarize
Yeah.
it in those last lines of, underlying her hardened soldier mentality is this love of her family and her farm and her brother. And
You're right, that's really interesting because, that farm, that's the first time a farm was mentioned in the
Yes.
story.
Yeah.
And that's gone.
And yeah, that's in a story that's dedicated to expanding this character, but it's because she's where she's at right now and so caught up in that. It's not,
And in the middle of the fanfic, when she was arguing with the other captain or whatever, where they were saying, you really should just retreat and retire and surrender so you can all live. And she's like, I can't because my brother is never going to abandon this as abandon this rebellion, and no matter what happens, I cannot not be there if I can when my brother's dying.
This fanfiction is so delicate in many ways. It's so subtle because there's lines like that that give you infinite insight into this character, and nothing else needs to be said for you to understand. They don't need to say, Maluda felt or thought this, or this was her past or her reflection. They have no reflections of her past and her background. They have few explanations for her feelings, but in her dialogue, there's almost everything. And in her position as this soldier fighting for this cause, everything is revealed, and you feel infinite sympathy for her. And that is brilliant to me. I think it's very well done.
Right. And in a way, there's this tension between Ramza and Delita throughout Final Fantasy Tactics, and she is similar to Delita in a lot of ways. She is fighting against the ruling class, and Ramza killing her in a way is sort of like Ramza killing Delita, or at least Ramza killing that sort of idealistic warrior.
Well, they don't have the advantage of working within the system like Delita does, because he has that access to privilege from growing up with the Baluvs, with Ramza's family, and they do not. And so that's the only
Real
direction
difference.
they can go, yeah.
Yeah. It was kind of interesting to pair these two fanfics together now that we're diving into it a bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's only 2 data points, but it might show where the interest of the sort of people who write Final Fantasy Tactics fanfiction, like where their interests lay.
The moral
Right.
ambiguity of
Yeah.
the character's motivation.
Not in like the crazy zodiac stones and demon plots, but in the really grounded historical war type nature and class struggle and like people's motivations and that kind of small character moments.
And these extremely character-driven stories, like these are like high literature kind of like character-driven stories, right? Like, I mean, I hate that sort of dichotomy between plot and character and like pulp and high fiction or whatever, but they're like character-driven, and it's not kind of what I would have expected, you know?
Speaking of high literature, our first author, Nistel, mentioned that her story was heavily inspired by the short story Bullet in the Brain by Tobias Wolff, which I've never read.
Sure.
But,
I
she
can
was...
see that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think very, like, strictly and literally see that because it's, like, the narrative of someone dying.
Right, exactly. In both stories, there's some exploration of what it feels like to die. In this second story with Maluda, it's that last paragraph where she's dying and she lets go of everything.
Yeah.
And with the first story with King Delita, it's this long, reflective process.
Yeah.
So having come to the end of both fanfics, these 2 fanfics were judged. And instead of doing our usual things we want to complain about, things we want to praise, I want us to look at it like judges. And the 2 categories, if you recall, were quality of the writing and entertainment value. So for each of these 2 fanfics, which do you think is the stronger point? Quality of the writing or entertainment value? You could think of it as, did you enjoy it more or did you appreciate it more?
That's a very difficult question.
I'm trying to trip you all up.
Well, here's why I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult because the first fanfic is so entrenched in the lore and the plot of Final Fantasy Tactics. It's almost it's an epilogue, right? Whereas the second fanfic...
She was looking to Vagrant's story to get clues to continuity to, like, inform the content of the fanfic, right?
Right, and does that very well. And then in the second story, it's this illustration of a scene within the game. But going back to your question, going back to the first fanfic, I think the King Delita story is less about entertainment and more about an exploration. So in that way, I would say the writing quality is what shines the most.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, but I wasn't interested in it because of the writing quality. It was the content, I think.
Yeah, I would score that higher on entertainment value as well. I enjoyed it more. Like, I appreciate the second fanfic, but having just read a playthrough of Tactics, I was like, yeah, I know basically what happens to Melita. Like, this is basically the same dialogue. Like it's better written, but I wasn't as engaged as I was in the Delita story.
Also, with the second story, with the Melita story, I did have one point where we didn't talk about where they're being chased by, I forgot what they're called, the Hokuto no Ken Brigade.
Hokten?
Hokuton?
Yeah.
Essentially the player.
Right.
And that's one thing that I love in terms of entertainment.
Well, at that point where I got a little bit lost because there was several long descriptive paragraphs about them running through the countryside, which I had problems concentrating, getting through.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. And so second story, would you say the quality of the writing shines through more than the ability to hook you or keep you fully engaged? I don't know.
Yeah, I listened to the second story more than I listened to the first, and that was to pick up on everything, but like having, kind of reread it here and looked at it, there were so many shining points of writing that were really beautiful. And I think there's beautiful writing in both stories. So, like, I'm not trying to pick favorites, even though Amato wants me to. But in the sense of that, like, yes, the first story I grasped very easily and it flowed throughout to the point where I could read it very quickly and felt very engaged. The second one, I think maybe I didn't have enough context, but also, like, it was more about certain particular points of writing rather than the flow throughout.
Yeah.
So I think I would agree with everyone's
So
analysis.
to answer
on
your
that.
question, Amato, I think my answer is the first story I want to see as a fan work short film.
Yeah.
And the second story was most likely to still make me cry.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about this.
True.
I talked about this before, and you agreed with me then. But it's just, as former drama kids, the first one I really do just want to see it staged.
Yeah.
Like you could do such a cool one act with like the dying king and like these various memories, and some of the scenes are just really asking to be portrayed.
In like really awkward parts, we dim the lights, and you have people and the stagehands come out in black and move the cubes around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Between the
Oh, you
two.
can make it so artsy.
Yeah, and if you have all of the return scenes to the king dying, would you just like put a dead king back on stage, dim the lights, do another scene, put a dead king back on
Now
stage?
he's just the same actor. You put a like white beard on him and lay him back down, and you make him open his cloak and
Just
show the wound.
curious.
And in the flashbacks, he keeps his cloak closed.
Yeah, the actor
Yeah,
the actor would be
that's
standing
brilliant.
up and lying down a lot, and there'd be some indication like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. Let's do it.
What was entertaining to me about the second story was you get the experience of what it would be like to face down the protagonist of a video
JRPG?
game, like a
Oh, God.
JRPG.
Should be terrifying.
Yeah, and Ramza.
She's like, he's really young, but he's moving really fast.
He seems like
Makes no
this
sense.
monster, and,
Right.
Yeah.
and he's naive. Not only is he a monster, but he's saying I don't want to fight you. But then when he's like, okay, no, I am going to kill you because you're saying, oh,
If we can't talk this out, I'll just kill you.
right. And he does it with this ruthless efficiency, and he stabs her through the heart, right? And so it's entertaining in that sense of it's well written in the action.
Yeah. And then he loots her memories when she turns into a crystal.
That's brutal.
That is really brutal.
Right.
That's a bummer.
These stories really point out the brutality of these narratives that I think the game kind of makes more light, even though like I don't think the game's trying to make them light. I think it's the same thing we were talking before, like you're more focused on the mechanics and like you leveling up in your job tiers than you are on this intensity that is so emotional.
It definitely takes it much more seriously than any other of the Final Fantasies.
Yeah,
We're
exactly,
just fighting
yeah.
mobs.
There's issues with that kind of gameplay story integration when you move away from a game. And so we've said before, but it was a smart move on both these parts to like basically take away the gameplay and pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Like it worked well.
Well, because it wasn't necessary for a narrative.
Now then, this was episode 23 of Retro Fanfic Retrospective, Delita the King and the Ending of a Revolution. I forgot to give the links to them, but you can find them still hosted on the Icy Brian site. Our short links are bit.ly/RFRTactics1, that's, just the numeral 1, and bit.ly/RFRTactics2. Next week, for our episode which is coming out around Valentine's Day, I decided I hate love and romance, so I did not want to do a romantic fanfic.
You think that'd be a pretty obvious
Shut up,
pick?
you're
or-
married.
Yeah, you know why we got
I'm
married?
single. Screw you.
Tori, we got married so we didn't have to date anyone anymore, because that
Yeah,
sucks.
well, if I was married, then I don't date anyone. Never mind.
Anyway, I decided instead of
I'm
celebrating love, we're celebrating another very important part of Valentine's Day, which is sales of cards.
Oh.
And we're doing a
Oh,
Care
that's a good
Bears
idea.
I was
fanfiction.
gonna say
Oh,
franchising,
excellent.
yeah.
Yeah.
Although you think it's kind of a big miss for a fanfic podcast not to do some sort of slash fic.
We'll get back to slash fic at some point.
Yeah,
In fact, I
really,
think
like we've only done ones that I've hated, like the Kirk Spock. I mean, I didn't hate the fanfic; I just hate the pairing.
you'll be happy to know I've got some slash for the episode after this lined up.
Oh no.
Okay.
If that'll
We'll
appease
see.
you.
No, probably not.
Myself, I just want to see True Heart Bear be a badass.
So,
And Noble Heart Horse.
Yeah,
He
that's
can come
actually way
too.
better.
yeah. And Gaelan, thanks for coming out with us.
Hey, you bet. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It really needed somebody who knew about Final Fantasy Tactics in order to talk about these.
you saved us.
It was a lot of fun just going back into what I experienced as a kid and then as a teen and then now going back as an adult. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, as part of the slow campaign we have of getting everybody we know at one point on the on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yep.
You just have to find the right hook for him.
Right.
Well, this one we really needed Gaelan for. I'm just gonna say that out loud. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't mean to insult you, but Gaelan was
I
necessary.
will say that in Final Fantasy Tactics, I did the grind that every good Tactics fan does. Every character to 99th level, mastering every class except for Sunrunner.
Accumulated 99
Wow.
Excaliburs from enemies throwing them at you, right?
Torturing a chocobo from 1 to 99 on the very first map. That's the way to do it.
That's why we needed you.
That's where you get your insight from.
Yeah, those are the kind of gray moral decisions you have to make.
I learned so much from torturing that one chocobo forever.
How slow can you make that chocobo?
Oh God.
How many times can you shout?
Right, it's really a game about animal ethics more than anything else.
This is why I never made it all the way through the game.
So next week you can find the link at bit.ly/rfrrise. The fanfic is going to be called Rise and Fall. A Care Bears fanfic.
Bit of a non sequitur, don't you think, Amada?
Well, yeah. Look, I needed to end the podcast.
It's a joke.
The intro song to this podcast is The Weekly Fare off of the album Poppy's Incredible Adventure by Komiku. The outro song is Run Against the Universe from the same album. You can find this album and other works by Komiku at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. You can find our website at retrofanficretrospective.podbean.com or bit.ly/retrofanfic. Have questions, comments, or thoughts about the episode? Contact us on Twitter at retrofanfic, or send us an email at retrofanficretrospective@gmail.com. Leaving comments or reviews on Apple Podcasts in particular would also be greatly appreciated. I'm Amato.
I'm Tori.
I'm done.
I'm Gaelan.
We're just 4 Earth life forms trying to be nice to each other.
Let's go torture some chocobos for experience.
Yes, trying to be nice only to each other. To everyone else, we are cruel.
Yeah, screw chocobos.
And then breed them.
Until next time, take care.
You've been
Yeah,
on the chocobo.
bye. Oh God. That was our least organized episode we've ever done.
I don't think that's true.
Okay, maybe that's not true. I felt disorganized is how I feel.